This is a small 7 by 10 inch transparent watercolor of a golden winged warbler done on a block of Arch's 140-pound hot press paper. These beautiful birds only come to our region of Michigan for a few weeks every year. When I'm lucky enough to see or hear them, it really makes my day. The painting was started by masking off the foreground with liquid frisket. I wanted to have a blurry background with distant trees, leaves, and sky, so I thoroughly soaked the page with water using a 1-inch flat brush. I mixed up a sky blue with cerulean blue and French ultramarine, as well as 6 different greens for all the foliage. I used these for the opening washes and to pull colors from throughout the painting. They were made with varying amounts of phthalo green, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue. Often those were desaturated with chrome orange or cadmium red. Once I was sure the page was evenly wet, I started by floating in some of my sky color to the wet page using a 1-inch flat brush. I start with the blue to keep that color the cleanest. If I started with the greens, well, then my sky might have some of the green mixed in with it. I keep the area around the bird blue to set it off from the background better. After that, I started bringing in my greens. Since the paper is plenty wet, the colors should mix and soften on the page. As it slowly gets drier, any additional paint put on the page will have less water to mix in, and it'll be less blurry looking. I kept my overall lighting in mind, blocking in some darker areas as shadows in the clumps of the leaves. I switched to a dry number 2 round brush to suck off some of the puddling paint around the bird, which might cause fringing. After that, I started using the same brush to drop in more varied greens on the page. With the basic blurry areas of the most distant background done, I hit everything with a hairdryer to lock it in. Now I could start suggesting some middle ground leaves and bundles of foliage. I switched to a number 6 round brush and started faking in some leaves. I don't want a lot of detail or contrast, just an indication of some extra elements in the frame. Your brain kind of fills in a lot of information without having to render every last detail. I use the basic shapes of my masked off leaves as a general size and shape to use. Where I wanted some more out of focus areas, I'd re-wet the page and put in some blurry branches or leaves. In the middle ground, I like having sharp edges as well as areas moving in and out of focus. That helps move the eye through the painting and build depth. Sometimes rather than just painting darker leaves, I'll paint around an area and create a lighter leafy shape. I periodically hit things with the hairdryer so I didn't drag any wet pigment around the page. I thought things were pretty good in the background for now. I like leaving some options open back there for later in the painting rather than rendering every last detail this early in the process. I removed my frisket and transferred my foreground lines using a tracing paper transfer. You may notice my new helper lending a hand. That's Zuki, our green-cheeked conure. She's a bit of an art director, bossing me around at times. How can I argue? Obviously, she has impeccable taste in color. We teach each other patience. With those lines in, I started by dropping in a quick pass of shadow color to establish my basic lighting. That was done with a mix of my sky color with a touch of dioxazine purple added. With some indication of shading, I started putting in my lightest local colors, starting with a warm gray on the branches. I followed that up with some lemon yellow on the head and shoulders of the bird. After that, I was putting in the base colors for the leaves. Rather than working on one section of a painting at a time, my goal early on is to cover up as much of the white of the page as soon as possible. Blocking in things like this usually goes pretty quickly, and it's fun to see things develop rapidly. For some of the more distant branches, I bring in a glaze of my leafy green colors as reflected fill light, which lowers the contrast and helps them recede. From here out, I was glazing in many, many layers of paint to build detail, textures, full values, and contrast. I started with another pass of grays on the branches. After that, there is no shortage of leaves to work on. Generally, I'll try to bring the level of detail up more or less evenly across the painting, starting with the largest areas first. That can save time mixing. In this case, I was working on loads of greens for a while before working on my branches again. For the grades of the branches, I ended up using a fair amount of light washes, pushing some sections warmer with a glaze of red and later bringing in blues and greens in places. On the whole, it seems to read as gray, but it has a lot of color information to keep it interesting and build textures and shading. I used a ton of different greens on my leaves. They varied a lot between light and dark, as well as saturated and unsaturated. I was mostly using my premixed colors from my well plates, supplementing them with colors from the Butcher's Tray palette. Saturated options picked colors from next to each other on the color wheel. For example, bright saturated yellow-green was made with lemon yellow, with its neighbor from the color wheel, phthalo green. Desaturated colors were made with pigments moving across the color wheel. For example, an olive color was made with phthalo green and its split complement chrome orange. Similarly, a super dark was made with phthalo green and cadmium red. As I was glazing in all these colors, I was keeping in mind my overall lighting coming in from above and slightly left of center. Many light transparent layers of increasingly darker pigments starts to build your textures and depth. My supervisor showed up again to inspect progress on the painting. Mostly she sits on my shoulder, but when she wants a little more attention, she begins venturing down my arm. Eventually she starts grabbing the paintbrush. So she got some attention with the petting and was content once more. I brought in more blue and purple to the shadowy areas of the leaves and branches. Those colors should help unify things down the road. After more time on the foliage, I decided I should get in some detail on the bird. The back of the bird went in with some grayed out blues and purples. Darker versions of the same purplish color were used for the mask, throat, legs, and rump. Getting more color on the main subject felt good. Now I was back to more of the greenery for a bit. There's a lot of work that needed to be done there. Leaves always take longer than the birds. While my brush was loaded with greens, I put in a wash of my green to the belly of the bird as reflected light and shading. I brought in some lemon yellow to add a wash of color to the wing's edge, and then glazed in more detail to the gray on the back. For the darkest areas of the bird's face, I brought in some alizarin crimson and phthalo green as a black substitute. Then I glazed in some warm gray browns to the wing. While that was on the brush, I started bringing in some of that color to the branches and the legs. From here out, I was switching between working on the bird and the rest of the painting. Eventually, I did pull out a 10-aught brush for some of the tiny details and sharpest edges. Beaks, eyes, feet, wings usually need some precision that the number 2 brush isn't always up to. I tend to only use the 10-aught brushes if I have to. Usually, I'm only pulling them out late in the painting. These brushes are good for detail, but they only hold such a tiny amount of paint. You're continually reloading them. Additionally, you're always mixing up tiny amounts of paint, so these dry up on the palette faster, so using small brushes slows you down in a few ways. A fresh and sharp number 2 round brush can be just as sharp, but relative to the 10-aught, they hold a ton of paint. Birds demand a lot of fine detail, so I do rely on 10-aught brushes. I also use a magnifying visor that you may see pushing into the frame now and again. Although I think 99% of people would say this is a painting of a bird, the majority of the painting is really leaves and other background. In most of my paintings, the birds really tend to account for only a small portion of the time and area that needs attention. For me, the backgrounds really are what makes the paintings interesting. There you have opportunities to add design elements to make things more interesting. You have options for colors to play with that can contrast or complement your subject. Golden wing warblers like this aren't really common in my area. We get them for only a few weeks of the year in migration. I've only gotten photos of them infrequently. I tend not to paint my best photos. I leave those alone. I usually paint for photos that have problems, but have elements that can be improved, fixed, and altered. Shots that were almost but not quite there. Some have elements that are interesting, but they need something else to make them work. This painting was based on some shots of a golden wing that I took locally. It had a lot of problems. It had a stick right in front of the bird's face. The highest area of contrast, grabbing attention, was a different branch, cutting the frame almost in half. Loads of problems, but many opportunities to reinvent and make something new. Compositionally, I used many of the elements that were in my photo, but moved them around a lot. I zoomed in more on the bird, cleared up the background behind it so it would pop more off the background. I moved many of the branches and lowered the contrast in them so they'd be less dominating. My photo was shot around noon, so the light was a bit harsh and had a strong shadow. I decided to soften that up a lot. As I approached the end of the painting, my little art director showed up again for a final inspection. I signed the painting, picked away at some last details that needed some sharpening, and called it quits. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to watch this small transparent watercolor of a golden wing warbler take shape. I truly appreciate it.